Hi, everyone, and thank you all for being here. My name is Shuchi, and I am the assistant editor and one of the nonfiction editors at AGNI and the co-editor of Futures and AGNI portfolio of work in translation. Thank you to our friends at the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith for hosting us through this virtual space. The Transnational Literature Series is one of the few event series in the country which really prioritizes supporting translators and work in translation. And it is housed at Brookline Booksmith, an independent bookstore in the Boston area, not too far from the AGNI offices at Boston University. So it's a great honor for us to be launching the portfolio at our neighborhood bookstore and with this series in particular. Just a few notes before we begin. Bonnie from Brookline Booksmith will be in the chat dropping in useful information, including a link to AGNI's website where you can purchase a copy of AGNI 94 and take advantage of a special 20% discount we're offering on subscriptions. The chat is an open space for you all to communicate during the reading, so please feel free to use it. And we will also have time for questions today, so please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to enter in questions you have for our guests. And today we are here to celebrate Futures, an AGNI portfolio of work in translation. AGNI is a literary journal which was founded by Askold Melnichuk in 1972 and is now co-edited by Sven Berkertz and William Pierce. We publish approximately 250-page issues a year of fiction, poetry, nonfiction, hybrid work, and art. Portfolios are a separate entity published far less frequently and are sort of a special insert within the issue. AGNI 94 here is one of those rare issues which is split in half. Part of the issue includes short stories, essays, and poems selected and edited by our genre editors. And then the other half includes the portfolio, which Jennifer and I spent the last 2 years co-editing. AGNI has always published translation. For example, we were the first to publish French author Patrick Modiano in English, thanks to translator Pepe Carmel, before Modiano went on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2014. But even still, we've never published a dedicated section of translation of this scale until this issue. So Jennifer, I'd love for you to jump in here and tell us a little bit more about the portfolio.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, especially to our fabulous translators. And thank you so much to Brookline Booksmith for co-sponsoring today's event. I want to say it's a real honor and privilege to co-edit Futures, the portfolio of translated literature with AGNI assistant editor and nonfiction editor Shuchi Saraswat. The largest folio in AGNI's 5 decades of publication, Futures showcases 35 translators and 37 writers of prose and poetry from 21 languages and across 3 centuries. Co-conceived 2 years ago before the pandemic struck, and in consultation with Christopher Merrill, Jill Schoolman, Asfa Habimnet, Johanna Domakosh, Ellen Elias Brzak, among others. It emerges out of Shuchi's and my abiding interests in translated literature, and in part as deeply felt response to our colleague Sven Berkert's essay, I Write This as the Amazon Burns. Berkertz ponders, even the merely dire, what an expression, is a prospect to be grieved. So many things will no longer exist, either at all or as we knew them, but how intensely will we mourn? The prospect of collaboration is one sliver of light, but how much will that avail? Our futures depend on each other. While editors are not forecasters, we are deep listeners, as our own Will Pierce astutely says. And listening to this gathering of astonishing poets and writers is to lean toward the most wrenching challenges culminating into our 21st century human condition. The furnace of climate catastrophe, perpetual war, rising ethno-nationalisms, the disappearing of languages and cultures, urgent or forced migrations across borders. How are poets and writers drawing from the past, charged with the necessities of the present, to envision and give witness to collective futures? This is a portfolio with weight, the weight of histories, the bending of time, and a shared feeling of what's at stake. And I couldn't be more proud and privileged to co-edit with Shuchi, to extend AGNI's commitment to a cosmopolitan perspective and embrace of all writing that's singular and vital. And I couldn't be more honored to do this work collaboratively in the hope of widening that sliver of flame. And to start us off today, it's my great pleasure to introduce E.J. Ko. E.J. Ko is the translator with Marcy Calabretta-Canciobello of Yiwon's The World's Lightest Motorcycle. Ko and Canciobello translated Yiwon's poem Self-Portrait for the Futures portfolio from Korean to English. Ko is also the author of the memoir, The Magical Language of Others, the poetry collection, A Lesser Love. Her poems, translations, and stories have appeared in Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, AGNI, Slate, World Literature Today, and elsewhere. She's a PhD candidate in Korean and Korean American literature, history, and film at the University of Washington, Seattle. And Yiwon is the author of 6 books of poetry and essays. A successor to feminist poets like Kim Hye-sun, she often writes about the perilousness of maintaining one's human identity in a high-tech digital environment. She's professor of creative writing at the Seoul Institute of the Arts. Please welcome E.J. Ko.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Shuchi. It feels like we've been waiting maybe years to do this together. And with Jennifer, I've been secretly hoping to do something with you as well for a very long time. And it was just so such a surprise actually to be asked to be here today, because I thought, no way, I can't join these translators. They're so amazing. So this is a one incredible portfolio you've put together. And I just want to say thank you for doing that. I'm going to jump right in here and read a self-portrait by Yiwon. I put my head on display at Irsan Market, but after several days, no one had bought it. I put my head up for auction online, but got a notification that when you click on my head, an hourglass appears, a loading error. I take my head to a flea market, but somebody blows it up like a balloon, and my wrinkled head gradually smooths out, and my mouth chews on someone's fingerprints, and to my great relief, my mouth has yet to howl. I'm gonna read 2 more short poems. And I love what you said about the collective futures and a future where we depend on each other. And I felt that so deeply as well with Yiwon's work. This one's called On the Street. Plugs are unthreading from every part of my body, suspended like umbilical cords. I open the door and go outside. Foul air clusters at the end of each plug. People everywhere walk with plugs suspended from their bodies, charged by the world's rage. In the spaces between them, pebbles clothed in the air float buoyantly. I'm reading from Yiwon's The World's Lightest Motorcycle, which is just out from Zephyr Press, and they made this beautiful book. So I think I got both of these at the same time. So it was early Christmas for me. This is a last poem called Shadow. Dragging the asphalt on a sweltering midday, one dark shadow passes along. The shadow is quiet like a digital clock. A swarm of air appears from some unknown place, pours over the shadow like barley tea from a kettle. The reek of slaughter. So it was an animal. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ. Next, we're going to be hearing from Mui. Mui Poopoksakul's translations include Pravda Yoon's story collection, The Sad Part Was, and Moving Parts, and Duanwad Pimwana's story collection, Arid Dreams, and Pimwana's novel, Bright. A native of Bangkok who spent 10 decades in the US, she now lives in Berlin. She translated Warpaj Penpong's essay, Brittle, for the Futures portfolio from Thai to English. Warpaj Penpong has published more than 20 collections of interviews and nonfiction prose. In 2019, he won the Silpathorn Award, a national recognition for mid-career artists. Originally from Nakhon Ratchasima, he founded and runs the Northern Thai Poetry Festival, Nan Posi. Please welcome Mui.
And hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and very grateful to be included in the portfolio, of course. I'm going to be reading Brittle, and I'm going to be skipping around the piece in the interest of time. So, the sea at Gossamet is calm and clean at the cusp of winter as the rainy season ends. It makes you want to sprawl on the sand, maybe dip your feet in the translucent, sun-filled water. Phuket, Kanchanaburi, Chiang Rai, or maybe Phrae or Nan. I could head to any of those. I could be happy at any of them too, since I know places to stay, places to eat, and in some cases have friends I could say hello to. Anywhere is better than stuck sloshing around in the capital. Bangkok's been flooded for more than 10 days now. Not sure what metrics were being used, but I saw on the news this is the biggest natural disaster in 75 years, and it's eating up land in 26 provinces. As of October 29, 2011, the death toll was shot up to 373, with the number of flood victims exceeding 2 million. Tens of national roadways are blocked off. Traffic is no way to get through. Aside from the tsunami at the end of 2004, based on the empirical observation of this 40-year-old, water has never wreaked such havoc. People rowing the streets I've seen before, but I've never seen the streets of Bangkok, hundreds of its intricate little side streets and alleys, underwater like this. Lots of motorbike taxi stands have morphed into water taxi piers. Rich or poor, home-long, swamped, or lucky enough to be spared, it doesn't matter. Every face is lined with worry. Will there be running water? Will the power stay on? What to do about the next meal? A fistful of cash is no guarantee you'll be able to buy supplies. Drinking water can't be found in any convenience store, absolutely none at any location. The other day, they still had some in stock, but the rule was 6 bottles max per customer. Shelves once crammed with food and other supplies have become voids. Delivery routes have been interrupted and many factories are underwater. So says an A4 sign posted on a fridge door in one of the shops. The same notice promises that the situation will be rectified ASAP and confirms that the store will maintain its regular round-the-clock hours. We'll get through this together. We'll be a neighbor to you always. Not the coolest copy, but at least earnest. Hip cafes, bars and pubs, and the lobbies and lounges of 5-star hotels are deserted. In complete contrast to the hotels and other accommodations in Pattaya, Phetchaburi, and Kanchanaburi, which from what I hear are busier than they've been all year, with the exodus of folks fleeing the water to dry their tears elsewhere. Instant noodles are selling like hotcakes. There's a shortage of sand. Egg prices have skyrocketed. Vegetables are priced like gems. You're staying open every day, right? I asked the woman who runs my go-to made-to-order food joint, until I run out of ingredients. Ingredients she more or less still has. Pork dishes cost the same, but the price of a fried egg has crept up to 8 baht. A whole tilapia sliced and fried is 80 baht. Most items on the menu have gone up by 5. I noticed that not a single customer is complaining, maybe because they understand the situation for one thing, and for another, the other shop shuttered days ago to escape the water. Letting Miss Granny gouge you a little seems like a better option than starving. In fact, I have no reason to put up with these circumstances and hang around guarding Bangkok. I was born a country boy. When the going gets tough in the city, ways to opt out and cut out are wide open to me. Plus, when I heard that the rice back home was at full term, ready to be harvested, my heart trembled, yearning to return to see the yield on the land of my youth. Every time a long distance bus drives by, my mother probably cranes her neck to see if she can spot her son. She's probably muttering something about people in Bangkok possibly having nothing to eat with such terrible flooding. And if there's nothing to eat, or if it's it's a struggle to stay. Why not come home? My mother wouldn't understand the non-reasons I've mentally shackled myself to the capital, or what or who here is making it hard for me to break free and leave the city. All things considered, I should have been the first in the scramble to pack up my things and take off. By now, I could be lying back, gazing at the stars from a paddy side hut, my eyes and mind smiling. But no, I'm still in Bangkok, staying with her for better or for worse, mostly worse at this point, watching her take shallow breaths, listening to her snivel, and I'm following the news, which more and more by the day seems to flood the screens like water rising up, like the water rising up outside. To my surprise, I don't feel the urge to grab my camera. A photographer friend, on the other hand, has been dashing around the city like a madman. Wherever the flooding's especially severe, he'll go and camp out there. I heard the other day he went and pitched a tent for the night on the Don Mueang tollway to snap pictures of planes swimming in the deluge. I respect and admire his journalist instinct. I get it. These pictures will capture a moment in history that it's up to our generation to document. A history of brittleness, a country of brittleness, a society of brittleness. You rap on it once and the whole thing crumbles. With all due respect, because I don't think the current disaster is trivial or easily solvable, all of it shows that our country lacks a taproot. Just a bit of wind and water and the entire trunk is shaken. We don't know how to gear up for such a scenario. We don't know how to manage it because we've never studied the sky and the water in an organized, detailed way. So what ensues is chaos and finger pointing, blame being launched at other people, other organizations. Brittleness isn't unusual, but if you're brittle today, you should aim to be solid tomorrow, not stay brittle year in, year out, brittle time and time again. One night on the sidewalk near Holumpong Station, a local man said after watching the news on TV, "Shoot them all, the thieves breaking into flooded homes. As if people aren't suffering enough, these criminals are kicking them while they're down. People of that ilk shouldn't be kept alive to weigh down the country." I agree these burglars with flippers are scumbags, but shooting them dead is surely going too far for a crime like stealing. It's not only our society as a whole that's brittle, our mood is brittle too. We're touchy, especially when food and goods cost so much. I love Bangkok. I love the people, I love the brightness and darkness of this city, but gazing at the moon tonight, I miss home. This afternoon, though out of character for her, my mother called. She said they were getting ready for the harvest and to come home for a bit if I have time. My mother put it casually enough, like it's no big deal, but after I hung up, I felt as though I were drowning in the floods. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. So powerful. It's my great honor to introduce Ruth Ward. Ruth Ward's creative collaborations center on the Mediterranean, particularly Malta and Spain, where she has long worked on flamenco and other Spanish dance productions. Her poems, stories, and translations have recently appeared or are forthcoming in the Los Angeles Review, Antigonish Review, The Common, Hunger Mountain, AGNI, Modern Poetry and Translation, and Southward. Her literary works have been published, performed, or translated in 16 countries. She is a US-based member of PEN America, and she translated Emmanuel Mifsud's poem, Talk to Me Nana, for the Futures portfolio from Maltese to English. Emmanuel Mifsud is a 4-time National Literary Award winner and a member of the National Order of Merit of the Republic of Malta. He was awarded the European Union Prize for Literature as the first Maltese writer to have given a reading at the US Library of Congress. Please welcome Ruth.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate being associated with an organization that is so strong in supporting fine literature and writers at every stage of their careers. I'd like to also take a moment to thank Emmanuel's publisher, Joseph Mitzi, who gives us support from that side of the ocean. And I'd like to thank Manuel's other translators, past and present. We all work together to keep this work alive. We're going to start out, I believe, by hearing Manuel do a reading of Talk to Me Nana, in the original Maltese.
Kellimni Nanna. Nanna kellimni fuq il-bahar font u ikħal. U l-imħar mal-blat u r-rizzi fil-qiegħ. Dwar dawk in-nofsanari fuq il-bejt dwar l-iljieri it-tanta tot l-istilel u tkejjel minn hemm fuq it-tul tax-xefaq. Kellimni fuq l-eliqi fejn kont tiġri, kellimni fuq ir-riħa tal-ħamrija tfewwaħlek imnifsejk war l-ewwel xita. Kellimni fuq il-fjur kull kulur u fuq il-frifet jinħabbu f'nofs mejju. Fuq is-siġar taż-żinżel u l-ħarrub, kellimni fuq it-tut taż-żabbarija, fuq kif jikber il-kappar fuq is-swar. Kellimni fuq ir-raġel tal-bigilla idur mat-toroq tagħkom fuq il-ħmar. Kellimni fuq it-tork ta' taħt it-taraġ, fuq il-ħares jistenna ħdej l-intrata fuq il-ħut tal-qiegħ jinxtewa fil-landa. Kellimni fuq l-iskorfon u s-serran u fuq l-aljotta u s-soppa tal-armla. Kellimni fuq il-ħobs bil-qoxra mbaskta, kellimni fuq il-foqra u t-tallaba li kienu jterqu triq b'żarbuna waħda. Kellimni wkoll fuq żewġa it-tarznar jismadda u jgħid it-talb fil-baċir. Int tilqaw ġej bis-slima u bil-ħobża jum ieħor għad-dawmar għall-grazzja talla kellimni fuq dik borna tibla l-bombi. Kellimni fuq il-ħoss tal-ajruplani. Fuq kif tajt nifsek taħt il-blat fix-shelter, kellimni fuq ir-rifuġjati Nanna. Fuq kif jiġġarfu d-djar u kif spiċċajt ma' nies li ma tafhomx ġo iħħa l-qormi. Kellimni fuq it-terrapin tad-djar li kienu ma baqgħux u dmuħ mimġarba. Kellimni fuq l-Ohio nofsu mejjed, kellimni fuq Awwissu u Settembru, kellimni Nanna fuq id-daq tal-qniepen, kellimni fuq il-passiġġati twal il-ħdud wara nofsinhar, kellimni fuq it-tombla fil-bitħa jew fuq l-atba. Kellimni fuq uliedek, fuq uliedhom, kellimni fuq ix-xemx li m'għadix tidher, fuq il-belt li m'għadix hemm, fuq ir-raħal li xi darba kienu llum sparixxa. Kellimni fuq l-oljiet li llum sfundaw, fuq l-art li qed iċċedi taħt it-toqol. Kellimni fuq kemm saret ibsa t-tela u fuq kemm saret twila t-triq sal-pjazza. Kellimni fuq il-kwiet li hemm fid-dar. Fuq is-skiet ta' wara nofsinhar. U d-dalma li tħoss nieżla għal xil-ħamsa. Kellimni fuq il-kliem li qatt ma għedt, fuq il-ħolm li ħlomt li nħallu nħela. Kellimni fuq is-seklu tiegħek Nanna, kellimni fuq il-darba ilu ħafna. Fuq il-bidu, in-nofs u fuq it-tmiem. U jekk jaqbadni n-nas, tħallinix norqod.
Great. And now we shall hear the English version, a bit about this poem. It's dedicated to Maria de Leccio Necasar, the poet's grandmother. Nanna, talk to me about the deep blue sea and the clams on the rocks and the urchins on the seabed. Talk about those afternoons on the rooftop, about nights spent trying to count the stars and measure how wide the horizon. Talk about the open fields you ran in, the smell of the soil, a balm after a first rainfall. Talk about the many flowers' colors, about butterflies making love in mid-May, about the jujube and carob trees, about caper bushes flourishing along the bastions, the mulberry sold by the street vendor. Talk to me about the seller of Bigilla, making the village rounds on his donkey. Tell me about the statue of the Turk on the stairs, the ghost waiting by the door. Talk about the deep water catch, roasting in a tin pan. Talk about the rockfish and comber, about fish soup, widow soup, and crusted bread. Talk to me about the poor, Nanna. Talk about the beggared, those who hobbled, wearing one shoe only. Talk to me too about your husband, the docker, his ears burning with profanity as he prays along the water, and how you welcome him home, bearing peace and bread. Another day is over with God's blessing. Talk to me of your town, of Bormla, bombed. Talk about the aeroplane's roar. Talk about suffocating in the underground shelter. Tell me about the refugees, Nanna. Tell me about watching the houses collapse and how you ended up in Ormi with strangers. Tell me about the rubble, houses no longer. Talk about the tears of the sufferers. Talk to me about SS Ohio, half destroyed on arrival. Talk about August and September. Talk to me, Nana, about the ringing of bells, of long strolls on Sunday afternoons. Talk about playing bingo in the yard or on the stoop. Tell me about your children, Nana, and their children too. Talk to me about the sun that is seen no more. Talk of the city that has vanished, the village now gone. Talk to me about hills, those that gave way. Talk about land that seeds under weight. Talk to me about how steep the incline has become and how long the walk to the square. Talk to me about the silence that fills your home, the afternoon stillness, the darkness you feel fall every evening around 5 o'clock. Talk to me about the things you've never told before, about the dreams you dreamed that wasted away, then dissolved. Talk to me about your century, Nana. Talk to me about a long time ago. Tell me about the beginning, the middle, and if you see me dozing off, please, Nana, don't let me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. When I first encountered that poem, I really heard it. And so it's wonderful to hear you read it in your voice and to have that gift of Manuel sending a recording of himself reading it as well. So, as we shift into the conversation part of today's event, I just want to remind everyone to use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. And I'm going to start with a question for each of you. For Ruth, I would love to hear a little bit about why Maltese. Why were you drawn to that language, and why did you decide to translate from that language?
My experience with translation began in Spain, but when I lived in Spain, my flatmate was Maltese, Sharon Sapienza. May she rest in peace. One of the things that Sharon insisted on was that I visit Malta. Malta was her home, and she wanted to share that with me. When she passed away, that was a promise, a commitment that I honored. And that gave me an emotional commitment to Malta and to the Maltese language that I may not have had in different circumstances.
So it was really that kind of love of that place, I guess, and that person that brought you to that language, which I think is so interesting because it makes me think of EJ and your memoir, EJ, which is so much about that relationship to another language and finding a family member through that relationship to another language. So I wonder, EJ, if you could, also talk about how you're a poet and a creative nonfiction writer, and how you came to translation in particular, and if that process, that kind of writing self, how you negotiate that when you are translating, and if you could talk a little bit about the process of co-translating, which I imagine is a little bit different. So.
Thank you for that question. And if I don't answer it completely, I might need reminders to make sure I touch upon it, because I do want to talk about collaborating with Marcy, who's just one of my closest friends. She's my sister now, basically. But I first came across translation when I was in my program in New York. I went there for poetry, and it's just wild because I never thought I would be a poet and then move to New York and take out $100,000 loan just to live in this tiny closet and write poems and say that that's all I really need. Because before that, I just was not a very good student. I want to say I was not into school, or I was a dancer in Los Angeles, and I grew up in clubs since I was a little kid, and I just thought that was for me. So when I met this amazing poetry teacher, because I couldn't fulfill a mathematics requirement, and my counselor told me, if you take this poetry class, we can dock off your breath requirement. And it led me to writing poems, and my poetry teachers taking me in and helping me get to New York. And I remember I was in a workshop with one of the teachers one day, and he said, oh, I remember this so vividly, but he said, if you want to be a good poet, write poetry. But if you want to be a great poet, translate. And I just had no idea what that meant. And I still think about it. I've since written him letters to ask more about it. But for some reason, that day I left the class and I said, I want to add literary translation. And this is something I really want to do. So by the time I left the program, came to Seattle, and found my mother's letters that I translate for my memoir, I didn't expect to become a translator. So when I found my mother's letters in Korean, and it was like, oh, okay, now I'm a translator, I can actually read these. It sort of came full circle that way for me. And for working with Marcy, that's so special, because another wonderful local poet translator, Dami Che, I went to her right after my program and said, I need help. I don't know what to do with these letters I found. And she encouraged me to translate them. And then right after that, she said, I'm translating Kim Il-soon, this a wonderful, amazing Korean poet. And I noticed that her successor is Iwon. And she said, I feel like I want to connect you and Marcy to Iwon. So it became this sisterhood instantly. All of us, it was Donmi and Kim Il-soon, me and Marcy and Iwon, and it just connected us across the ocean, and it connected us with our work and what we want to do for each other. And it created this sort of sisterhood. That's how I can describe it. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ. And Mui, you first encountered your translation work through Dwanwa Pimwana's books that you translated. And I believe this is the first author, journalist, so nonfiction writer that you've translated. And I wonder first, if you could talk a little bit first about how you came to translation as well, and then if it was a different experience translating nonfiction as opposed to short stories and novel length work.
So I'll speak first about how I came to translation. So I actually came from the corporate world. I worked as a lawyer for almost 5 years, and I think in the back of my mind, I always knew it wasn't what I wanted to do forever. So at some point, I had sort of a 1/3 life crisis and really did a lot of soul searching. I thought about what I wanted to do, and I am from Thailand, so I was aware that there was very little that's been translated out of Thai, especially outside of the academic context. And this light bulb just suddenly went off, and I ended up going back to grad school for literary translation. And the project started off, it was basically like, I thought if I could just get one Thai book out that is enjoyed as fiction as opposed to something academic, something that you read if you study Thai through a Thai studies department in the US, I just thought I would just be so proud. And so I went about doing that, and my master's thesis ended up being published as my first story, the first collection that I translated for Tilted Axis, and that was a Procter & Union collection. And how I came to translate this was my author Pravda actually knows Warapot, and he recommended his work to me, so I started reading him. And at first I was pretty focused on translating fiction, so I kind of read Warapot. I read him for fun over many years, and then finally I was just like, you know what, I really want to try doing nonfiction, just because I think after you translate a few books, it's sort of fun to sort of diversify what you do. And so I started thinking about translating him. And in terms of whether I think translating fiction and nonfiction is different, I don't think, at least the experience so far, and I've not translated that much nonfiction yet, I think that with Warapot, a lot of his work is narrative nonfiction, so it doesn't feel that different from fiction. It's more, with each author, it's more about how their prose differs, I would say, more than the fact that it's fiction versus nonfiction. Yeah.
Sort of picking up the baton here and thinking about some of the themes that all of your comments have touched upon. I'm really struck by how important kinship, love, sisterhood of translation, like what you were describing, EJ, and also we're thinking about the memory of a beloved friend and colleague who your translation work honors. And Mui also, a love for this literature that is underrepresented, given what you had said about how so much work and translated work in Thai is more for scholarly academic context. I'm wondering if you all can ponder translating toward love. And here, EJ, I'm thinking in particular about your conversation with Asymptote Journal for a moment, where you talked a little bit about, in that conversation, about translating toward love. Maybe if I can sort of push that even further, I think of translation as an act of love. Wondering if we can all sort of ponder that together. Maybe if I can invite anyone to jump in.
I will. Yes, translation is an act of love. We in this world are in a position where we are at the brink, and we have got to find a way back to exploring and embracing our interconnectedness as humanity. And that's going to take love to work through our differences and come together with a new direction forward. And when I engage in translation, that is my contribution to affirming that interconnectedness. And it takes vulnerability, it takes humility to approach another artist, another writer, and be open enough with that person so that their voice is amplified. And it's about setting your own ego aside, making the space within yourself to be that person's voice. And that's a beautiful way, I believe, to live. And so translation to me is not something that just happens on the page when I get an email with documents attached. It starts in a mindset and a commitment to love.
It's just so beautiful. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Jennifer, for bringing up that interview. And I think another aspect, and I'm pushing myself here because I don't want to say the same thing. I want to try and see where I go with this. But when I'm translating Korean to English, a part of where translation as an act of love felt like it was sprouting from was the languages having history and connected to countries, and those countries having histories with each other. And the feeling of what I'm doing as a translator when I connect those languages, and which language that is historically dominant or not historically dominant, and how I am either adding to that or trying to, I call it table setting, but put it all on the table. You know, don't take anything off. Yes, the bad, but also the good, you know, set the table for translations, for everything to be there. Let the Korean remain present. Don't let it just sort of drift away. Let it so that we know the Korean is still there. So there's no sort of against erasure in a way. But I'm also starting to feel like that willingness to translate as an act of love comes from a sense of hope that doing this is a step toward reparation, a step toward understanding these histories, because we have them, we hold them. It's not just to dislodge them through translation, but to how do we move on? How do we move on with them? And I think that requires love. And so there is a quite a big movement in that space and area. But I'm always trying to push myself toward, if I can't love every day. Some days it's hard, and it's harder to forgive some days. But if I can imagine myself going there, I'll push myself to translate there, to be better, to do better than I am right now.
So powerful. I mean, I love what you just said about sort of like a step toward reparation. It makes me think about that openness, Ruth, that you were describing, that translation can also be a way of connecting with the world. So that so much more is at stake than accuracy or access, which is a kind of colonial way of thinking about translation. You know, and here in thinking about our interconnectedness. Mui, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too.
I mean, for me, when you bring up love, Jennifer, and translation, for me, it feels really personal, because I do translate from my mother tongue and the literature of a country that I haven't lived in since I was a child. So for me, the translation journey has been so much about trying to connect with all of that, you know, with my country and my childhood, and and the language that I grew up speaking. So it definitely has to do also with generosity, because it's like trying to connect all of that with my present life, and also I'm translating toward the West. I mean, because I translate into English. So I think that love translates then into generosity. And I think that goes for me as a translator, but also for the authors who are willing to allow me to translate their work and to have that trust, and especially writers who don't necessarily read English that well. There's like a real leap of faith, and I really so much appreciate them, giving me their trust to translate their works.
Mui, I was wondering actually if you could talk a little bit about Brittle. One of the things that was so powerful in that essay is this idea of being in a brittle moment, and the brittleness of the moment that we live in, and that resonated so deeply with what I feel like I'm experiencing in this particular pandemic moment. How many things have been kind of pushed and really stressed, and that we're in this kind of almost moment of fracture.
Yeah.
And that essay he wrote after the 2011 flood, so it's something from 10 years ago. And when I had asked you, if you had anything to speak to the future and anything from the tie that you think would fit, you had thought of this. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what made you think of this essay, what was happening in your present maybe that made you think that this essay spoke to future.
Well, Shuchi, as it happened, when you reached out to me about the portfolio, I had been sort of translating this essay a little bit, thinking that I would try to make a collection of his essays. And then that was one of the pieces I was thinking of. But the week that you wrote me happened to be the week of the Rhineland floods earlier this year. So my husband's from the Rhineland, and my sister-in-law's house was completely flooded. Their cars got washed away and everything. So the piece was very present in my mind when you wrote. And so I thought, well, you know what? Yes, I knew the piece was 10 years old, but I think the mood of it is very current and also speaks to a future that could very much be real. And this idea of brittleness, it also really resonated with me, because I just think that, we all just go through our days and lives and thinking that all is fine, but it's like one domino and it all collapses, So I think that's one thing that this piece really gets at very well. And one thing that I also really love about Waraport Panpong's work is that he gives these like concrete moments from his day, and he inserts some humor into the piece as well. So it's kind of like you're doing life, even though there's like this whole disaster happening around you. So I just feel like, it all feels very concrete and very real, in the sense of like, even though all of this is going on, and you're still kind of having to carry on with your day and with your life as normal at the same time. So.
Gigi, should we shift to some of the questions that I see in the Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
And then I think there are a few in the chat too.
Yeah, thank you, Mui, for that response. And William Pierce here, he's one of the co-editors of AGNI, has a question. He asking, could each of you, Ruth, Mui, and EJ, talk a little bit about how you balance, on the one hand, being true to the work you encounter in the original, and on the other, to your sense of English and to the new work of art you create in translating? And Ruth, maybe we'll start with you to answer that question.
I would say that what I am reaching for in the work is more of what I would call a dynamic balance. Every poem, every story is well researched, but that happens on my own. When I receive the poem, it doesn't come across with explanations or footnotes. And so I am free to take that work and create something with it. without being immediately shackled by the poet's original intentions. The beauty of collaboration is then that that dynamic balance is built in, because Manuel sees what I do and considers what I do. And only if it jars, only if it goes, definitely goes against his intentions, there's a fluidity there, because we know we're balancing more than languages, we're balancing cultures as well. I think that sometimes as translators, we can be too cautious. And sometimes translated work ends up being, how to put it, a little dry. We're so worried about accuracy that we can press and massage and just edit the very life out of a piece. And so, all things giving equal, I'm going to allow that fluidity, and I'm going to push that poem a little, because I'd rather push it out to the edge and then have the author say, oh, no, rather than self-censor and hold back on working on meaning and emotion in the poem out of my own fear of, do I have it right? I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the subjectivity too that happens when we read and what we respond to, and then how that's carried forth into the translation process as well. I mean, you can't really sever that emotional response that you first have to a poem and the meaning you create from it. Thank you, Ruth. EJ, Mui, just again, Bill's question is, how do you balance being true to the work you encounter in the original, and on the other to your sense of English and to the new work of art you're creating in the translation?
I can go next. Well, for me, I feel like when you read Warport in English, or when I read him in Thai, it seemed like he would be someone who would not be so hard to translate, but it turned out very much not to be true for me. I think that the difficulty with translating him is that Thai and English are vastly different languages, and they have very different economies. I feel like most of my translations have shaken out to be approximately the same length as the original, but for very different reasons. Like Thai likes to have a lot of repetition in terms of having a string of synonyms in there just for the sake of the sound or whatnot, and you just repeat a lot more words. But it does have these economies. For example, we don't have articles, and it's very slim on grammar, so you wouldn't, like, for a pluperfect tense, you'd still have this one word that's the verb. So then where that comes in with Warport is that his writing has a certain breeziness that gives it this atmospheric feeling without writing too many words, and how to maintain that in English was somewhat challenging. And what I always try to do is that I read the translation side by side, like basically almost line by line, with the Thai, to see if the voice comes across the same. And that's what I try to do, because mapping syntax is just like, you can forget about it.
I was sort of smiling at your answer just now, because Korean is really similar with the sometimes there's no subject, and
that happens to me the whole time.
Just and so much of it has to do with context, but also if there is wordplay, it's so brief but lends to a multiplicity of meaning, and I remember speaking with Marcy, my co-translator, for a little bit, and it's fun to say, but not so fun to do, is that this, you know, Korean in some ways, especially Iwon, resists translation. And something about that, we really like it. We like that there are things here that don't want to be translated or don't feel like they'll ever be translated, not in the way we think of a seamless translation. And that's the area we get to go in together. And I think there is the invisible and visible, and that's a way of me sort of thinking about translating with the mind and translating with the heart. And what I think initially Marcy and we're translating with the mind because we have to get the things out, the intellectual, the pondering, the research. And then when we get to the heart, like you said, it gets so personal of what that is. How do you translate something invisible, something unseen? But it's been, what I know is that it's been a joy. It's been a surprise. And it's never the same. And the way we feel about translation always changes. And because not the amount of our presence changes, but who we are as writers, as poets also change. And I don't think there can be an answer.
I love that phrase, the EJ, translating the mind, translating with the heart. Mui, it makes me think about the generosity you were describing earlier. You know, that is part of how you're approaching translation, and it's so powerful to think about how translation is a full-bodied experience. It's the rearranging of senses and connection, and that when we are just sort of in our minds thinking about accuracy, that there's a lack of generosity, there's a kind of straitjacketing of really the work, so that it's not about translating that atmospheric, that, you know, when I heard you use that word breezy, I was thinking about how in many ways it's about translating breath, whether it's in prose or poetry. There's a translating of breathing, of breath, that you got to go in with the heart. It can't just be the head. Anyway, I'm just reacting out of so much joy right now and enjoying the conversation we're having.
You're so right. You're so right. Because so much of what matters, I think, in translation is the rhythm, how the rhythm of the translation compares to the original. So yes, I think you're spot on there.
I know we've got another question in the Q&A box. I think it's from Shiba Sundar. Thank you for sharing your work and for giving poems and stories in other languages, a home in English. Can you each say a little about the translation influences, how translation influences your own creative work as writers, maybe also as multidisciplinarians, because I know that we all have many interests in addition to the writing that we're doing, that translation is an influence on. Ruth, would you like to take that one to kick us off?
I can kick it off, but I'm not sure I have an answer, because in my particular case, there are core things that I feel passionately about. And then from the core, projects branch out in other directions. But so it all comes together for me. For example, we've talked a lot about love. And before we ring around, join hands and sing Kumbaya, I would like to say that sometimes love is very tough. It's hard love, it's fierce love. And so in my own writing and in the authors and artists I like to work with, I want to see that recognition that love is hard sometimes. We have a situation in Malta where an investigative journalist was assassinated. And that was some 4 years ago, and it still has not been resolved. Well, Manuel would say that, I mean, he writes the present. And so in the midst of all this love, part of love is truth and bringing things to the forefront. And so we have a work around that, but that also goes hand in hand with the work we both engage in via pen. Manuel, I believe, as you mentioned it, he is one of the co-founders and is the current president of PEN Malta. I'm a member of PEN America. So the work that we do on the page, there's an integrity with the other things we're involved in. And so we may be doing very diverse projects, but it all comes back to a core set of beliefs and values that we both share.
EJ, do you have any thoughts about how translation is also influencing other areas of creative practice for yourselves? You know, and sort of thinking about also a core that you're working from that translation is a part of.
I was telling Jennifer earlier that I get to work on all these creative writing projects. And I'm so fortunate to get the time to do that. So I'm working on prose, and I just wrote American Han for poetry, which was a big project of mine, but now I'm starting to expand it. It's poetry, it's multimedia, and it's a form of translation. It's translating a word that's considered untranslatable. And it's also a word that has a lot of ties and history with it in terms of global humanity, in terms of what are we talking about when we say Korean or Korean American, or what is all of that about? So American Han is something I've been like, I don't know if I could have come to that without my work in translation, to be honest. And the other project that I'm thinking of now is my love letter project. It's just something I do. A few years ago, I didn't know if I could write anymore. And I thought, this is so hard. Like Ruth said, you know, love is hard. And so I thought, if I could live without writing, maybe it's better not to. Maybe I could try that out. But I found during this long period of not writing, the one thing I couldn't live without was human connection. That's what I really, really wanted deep down. And so I started handwriting love letters to strangers. I just went online and said, I'm going to write 1,000 love letters to strangers. And if you want one, just send me an email, a bit about yourself and your mailing address. And last week I sent, I think, 323 love letters. It's something I'm still doing. So if anyone wants a love letter, you can get one from me. But when I think of that, it has a little bit of everything in it. It's got the toughness, it's got the love, it's got the wanting to find enough space. That I think the generosity comes in making myself bigger and bigger and big enough to hold as many opposing or terrifying or loving things as possible simultaneously. And that act sort of helps me do that. And I feel that, I don't know if this is true yet, but I'm starting to get a sense that the more I love, the more I am able to love. And that the practice comes before the act. So that's been really helpful.
Should I go? Yeah. So for me, I think since becoming a translator, one thing that I've been thinking about more and more is that, you know, when I write, perhaps I should make the quote unquote original multilingual, because I'm a Thai person who spent her formative years in the US and now I live in Germany. I don't always think in one language anymore. So I just think that maybe, I've always felt confined to English since, my whole working life and pretty much my whole student life as well. And more, I don't feel like that has to be the case. And because I can always translate myself at the end, so I just feel like the possibility of translation opens up this, this whole sea of languages that are open to me, and that the idea that a piece of writing could be dynamic through translation as well.
So viscerally, all the comments that you all are sharing. I mean, in many ways, I think, just speaking for myself as a diasporic person who's a Korean adoptee, translation is a condition of my life. I don't think I can really separate these things out from one another and silo them in some kind of neat box, because I'm constantly trying to translate, and it's not something I just kind of set aside and then I'm in this space where I don't translate. I mean, that never happens. So I just really feel viscerally what you all are saying, and just feel the generosity in it and deeply appreciate it.
Yeah. I know, Jennifer, when Jennifer and I were, this 2 years of conversation we've been having about this project, and we got down to kind of what's really driving this portfolio for us. Why are we so invested in this translation and in this topic we came up, and it came down to, in which you'll read in our introduction, is so much of the fact that we don't come from one language, we come from many languages, and we've always been navigating that fact and that reality of living with multiple languages. And translation just feels like one way to express that. And so, yeah, it's just wonderful to hear you all think about it in a similar way, and to have you all here together thinking about it. Thank you so much. We are unfortunately running out of time, but I just thought maybe before we go, if you could each just talk about maybe something you're reading right now that is bringing you comfort. We're all just a group of readers here, and as acknowledgement to our bookstore partner, I would love to just, kind of hear what are you reading?
I'm reading Bora Chung's Cursed Funny, translated by Anton Her, which I'm finding a lot of fun. I want to save it for my trip to Thailand, but I can put it down, but comforting is not the word. It's quite dark, but funny. Highly recommend it. Yeah. Surreal Korean short stories, contemporary. Yeah. Wonderful.
At the moment, I'm reading The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wingrove. And it is a retelling of origin stories, origin myths that will really change your way of thinking about everything, the dawn of everything. The reason that I'm enjoying the book in particular is that, coming off of these discussions around Talk to Me, Nana, there is a need sometimes to go back. And there's a West African concept, Sankofa. You go back and you get the wisdom that was lost. And I think The Dawn of Everything is a book that is doing a good job of that, and I would recommend it.
I'm reading a book I feel like I read again every year. I love books I could read again and again. And it's a collection of short stories by Korean women called The Future of Silence. And it's translated by Bruce and Jude Chan-Fulton, amazing translators. But the stories in this collection I come back to so often as I work on my own work, and I think it's got the heart of translation, right? It's wow, how I love this. I love this. This is what I think every time. So I'm enjoying a revisit.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Here's again, AGNI 94 with the portfolio in it. I think we all have a copy. I don't know if Mui's gotten hers yet in Berlin, but thank you for being here and for being part of this issue and for celebrating with us. If you would like a copy of the issue, I believe our online website's not, our online portal is not doing too well with taking orders, but you can email, I think it's in the chat, agni@bu.edu. We will help you out. We will get you an issue somehow. And thank you all again. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.